what. Thank you very much. I now call upon our last speaker. He's not the least, Brother Varghese Theckanath, a Montfort brother who's working in Hyderabad and is the director of Montfort Social Institute, a center for human rights and sustainable development and education. Varghese has been the former national president of the Conference of Religious of India and the convener of the Forum of Justice and Peace at his very initial stages. He has been deeply involved in providing relief and rehabilitation to migrant workers ever since the lockdown and is a co-committee member of Working People's Charter. He has been also a very deep and down-to-earth grassroots worker in the slums of Hyderabad. Welcome, Varghese. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sister Dorothy, for this opportunity to speak to this August gathering. Basically, on how do we respond to the challenges that Sister Lissy, Chandan, Cedric now presented. How has the church responded? Are there examples of responses to a situation like this in the past? And what type of responses? I will point out a few possible responses that we can embrace at this time in history. As the speakers have pointed out, the context in which we are living today is extremely volatile. A very historic moment that we are living through, where on the one hand, we have the havoc caused by COVID-19, and on the other, grave violations of human rights. Social, economic, and cultural on the one hand, civil and political on the other. How do we respond? As Father Agostino Zambini, a member of Vatican's COVID-19 Commission, pointed out recently, there is a need for a radical response to a radical crisis. The COVID-19 emergency is pushing the world to a different scenario altogether, he said. This will change the world in a manner that we may not recognize it anymore. As Pope Francis has said, we will necessarily emerge different. In fact, if we don't emerge different, we will disappear. And we have to decide if the future that we enter into is for better or for worse. How we respond to this tiny virus today will be an exemplar of how we will respond to viruses that are bigger. The harm that we have done, viruses such as the harm that we have done to the earth, our common home, viruses such as poverty, inequality, and rampant violations of human rights, as Father Cedric so succinctly pointed out. The pandemic, as we have it today, is not anything new in history. In fact, they have determined the destiny of nations, cultures, and peoples. They have altered boundaries of nations, cultures, and peoples. They have caused the rise and fall of kings and of peoples of power, depending on how society responded to the onslaught that pandemic was responded to at every juncture in history. In this context, I think it is pertinent to ask ourselves, ask the church, ask the 125,000 religious women and men in India today, how have we responded since the 25th of March when the lockdown was announced? I have identified at least 4 strands of responses that we have seen in the church, particularly among religious. I think the most prominent response of the church has been a total withdrawal. A total withdrawal from the pandemic, a total withdrawal from society and its challenges itself into the safety of religious houses, living in selfish peace, I would call, observing their religious practices, unconcerned with the situation of people on the streets. This was particularly visible in the first few months of the pandemic. A second type of response that I have observed is to adopt a very aggressive stance towards the pandemic, the people afflicted by it, the migrant workers, and many of the victims who were caught in the in this aggressive pandemic that they were caught into. This was particularly, especially people saying this is the result of sin, of the result, this is something that we deserved. This was particularly heard from the many preachers who emerged during this time of the pandemic, online preachers often. There were others who took to paying lip service to the victims of the pandemic, voicing what should be done while not lifting a finger to help them. Or at the most, they took to praying for the victims and others living in fear. They took to praying for heroic people in the field of medicine, in the field of the activists who are out in the field. They took to perhaps praying for them. This time, we also such people, there was a multiplication of online masses, novenas, prayers, preaching. In fact, this is something that became so prominent during this period, often paying lip services and praying, but not really helping people who were out in the field, supporting them, feeding them, and taking a stand, as Father Cedric rightly said. There was also a fourth category of people who took a very calculated risk. And I'm talking of this both in terms of protecting social, economic, and cultural rights of people, and taking a stand on civil and political rights of people. They took a stand to reach out to people. There are many who provided them food, shelter, medical care, psychological and spiritual support. There are others who put their freedom at risk by taking a stand on institutions of constitutional and political importance. And Father Cedric pointed out some of these heroes of our time. But we didn't find, I am afraid, many in the church taking on this political stand that is so much necessary at this point of time. And at the same time, these remain few when compared to the vast majority who I think fall in the first three categories. If COVID-19 and the Christian response is to leave a legacy that comes from the heart of Christian discipleship, it has to be proactive, protecting not only the economic, cultural, and social rights of people, as I said, but also taking a stand on issues of violence, violations of civil and political rights of people. I want to place before you two instances from history that tell us how the early Christian community responded to pandemics that were similar to the situation that we are faced with today. The first example I want to take is of Cyprian. In fact, that plague from 249 to 262 came to be named after this very prophetic person, Saint Cyprian, whose feast the church celebrated a few days ago. That particular pandemic, we are called, killed 5,000 people a day in the city of Rome. Cyprian was not a bishop, was a bishop of Carthage in Egypt. As the plague hit the city, the reaction of the inhabitants in general was of fear, and no one cared for any other. We are told that dead bodies piled up, heaped up on the streets with no one to bury them. Cyprian chose not to ignore the crisis and organized the Christians, who were few, to respond with courage and conviction. They served people on the streets, buried dead bodies, brought a sudden sense of sanity to society that had gone mad in the context of this pandemic. So much so, and one very clear instruction that he had given is that in this context, there is no one who is ours and who is not ours. Your service needs to be reached out to everyone who is in need, especially those who persecute you. And the heroic action of these few Christians in the city was such, the impact of it was such, that we are told that the entire country, the entire Roman Empire began to speak about this small group of people. The second instance I want to bring, and in fact, the action of Cyprian was not merely a work of charity. It was taking a stand in a system, in a situation, in a context where no health system whatsoever existed, where the state never took responsibility to provide health. This group of volunteers, this community of people challenged the whole Roman Empire, asking that it is the responsibility of the state to provide food, to provide shelter, to provide health, and to bury the dead. And the responses, later responses of the society at large itself changed in this context. The second instance I am talking about is of the epidemic that lasted from 313 to 312 to 313 AD. And this is described by Eusebius. He says, "For they alone, that is the Christians, in the midst of such ills, showed their sympathy and humanity by their deeds. Every day, some continued caring for and burying the dead, for there were multitudes who had no one to care for them, and multitudes of bodies that lay on the streets unburied. Others collected in one place those who were afflicted by famine and hunger throughout the entire city, and gave bread to them all, so that the thing became reported abroad among all men, and they glorified the God of the Christians." This demonstration of care was not a one-off event. It was repeated in town after town, village after village, in pandemic after pandemic. As Stark, the historian, has pointed out in his book, The Rise of Christianity, how the obscure marginal Jesus movement became the dominant force in the Western world in a few centuries. We are told from 250 to, in 250, the Christian community in the empire numbered less than 1 million. And we are told by 300 AD, it had come to 6 million people. Just to show how their response to a pandemic situation created the goodwill of people to this community, and more people wanted to be part of this community. And in this context, as Ferngren, a historian of the health systems, how the hospitals, how the health system as we have it developed, puts it, when the concept of a hospital began to emerge in the mid-4th century, it owed much to the church's long experience for caring for all. Without the immediate success of the hospital, I believe, would have been impossible. In other words, modern hospital system as we have it today owe it to the service that, the care, the health care that was provided by the Christians during the times of the pandemic. The founders and foundresses of religious congregations throughout centuries stuck to this tradition stuck to this tradition of doing what no one else was doing or did not consider worthwhile doing. Many of us present here belong to religious communities. And if we look at the lives of each of these founders and foundresses, one thing that stands out very prominently is that they did what no one else was doing or did not consider worthwhile doing. Plagues, pandemics intensify the natural course of life. They intensify our own sense of mortality and frailty. All of us are afraid when we will become positive. How frail we are, how mortal we are. This is something that comes to such awareness as far as our minds are concerned. There are also intense opportunities to display countercultural, counter-conditional love. Countercultural love. The church rose to the challenge in the 3rd and 4th centuries, winning both admirers on the one hand and converts on the other. In the process, they left behind a great legacy of Christian discipleship in times such as these. As we have listened to repeatedly, we have a government that has failed its citizens, particularly our workers who form our unorganized workers or migrant workers who form 94% of the workforce in the country. This government left these people without protecting them, their social, economic, cultural rights, and practically abandoning the responsibility of the state to uphold civil and political rights. I believe that if the response of the church is to leave behind a legacy as Cyprian left, as that community, that small community that is described by Eusebius left, then it has to be a very proactive, protecting not only, as I said, the economic, cultural, and social rights of people, but also taking a stand on issues of violations of civil and political rights. And Father Cedric so succinctly pointed out what these violations are in terms of our civil and political rights. When we talk of economic, social, and cultural rights, the most important contribution that we should be making at this point of time is towards health. Recently, a Chai note said that there are around 3,500 health institutions in the country who are members of Chai. And out of this, only 72 hospitals are actively involved in taking care of patients who are COVID positive. And often many of these institutions had to be pushed into it. Where does the First Christian community stand? The community of Cyprian stand? And where do our health workers stand today? Our hospitals stand today? This, I think, is a very important challenge. We don't know when the COVID will end, but this is a time when we need, more and more of us need to come into the field to protect, to provide health facilities, opening up our places to provide health facilities to people. Education is another major challenge in which the church is so greatly involved. We have been hearing on and off of the digital divide that exists. Now, can we bridge that digital divide that exists in the country today? For instance, one simple thing that we have started doing here is creating a digital bank of collecting mobile phones, laptops, which can be given to people who have no access to it. What is the intervention that we can creatively do in this field? A third is migrant workers that fled to their villages are returning. Now, how will we give them, and where will they, the biggest challenge is where will they stay? Accommodation, food, healthcare, to the large number of migrant workers who are returning to the cities and to the towns to find work. And work itself has become, we know, thousands and thousands of people who have lost their work. If only we have about 20,000 religious communities in India. If only we are able to, each of the religious communities is able to provide work, a small loan, a small grant to 5 to 10 people around their own institutions, we will be supporting 2 lakhs, 3 lakhs, 4 lakh people. In other words, we need to help people to find opportunities to restart their work, or especially domestic workers. That's what Lizzie was talking about. Hundreds and hundreds of domestic workers have lost work. How do we help them to get back to work? This is a major response that we need to attend to. We have huge infrastructures that are available, often lying vacant. In fact, I've seen people, slum after slum in Hyderabad, where there are positive cases in a family and they have no place to go to. They are home quarantined, and these positive cases and the rest of the members of the family has to confine themselves to the 1 or 2 rooms that they have. Can we open up our places for these families, whose families where they have positive COVID positive cases, where these people can come and live in our classrooms, in our seminaries, in our other institutions? This is a major challenge I think we have. When we talk of civil and political rights, as Father Cedric has already pointed out, we need to protect the pluralism of this country. We have to take a stand loud and clear, both individually and collectively, to say that we will not tolerate any deviance from the pluralism that this country has always protected and has been the very nature of this country, and the Constitution guarantees to us. We need to use RTI, we need to use the law, we need to use the courts, we need to use PILs, we need to write letters, we need to join groups that take a stand actively, proactively. We have to join events to express solidarity. We need to become, in fact, this morning we went to meet a couple of ministers regarding the issues of the Christian community in Telangana. And I was meeting G. Vinod Kumar, a former MP and the Vice Chairperson of the Planning Commission of Telangana. And when I told him the type of attacks that are happening, he said, your community is so apolitical, he said. You people need to become more politically conscious and you need to take a stand, he said. You are citizens and you need to assert your citizenship. If a violation happens to your right, go and make a complaint, register. We are a people so careless in protecting our own rights and protecting the rights of others. The whole question is, will we become political? Will we become proactive? Will we become people who stand out and say, no, this is not, we will not tolerate this? And in that context, more and more people will be arrested. As of now, there are 15 people who are arrested. One of my friends, one of the very early supporters of our housing rights movement, Varavar Rao, is in jail. You know, the others who are in jail. Arrests are going to happen. There will be hundreds and hundreds of people in this country in the coming days and months who will be jailed, who will be, all sorts of cases will be posted against them. The question is whether will we be among them? Will the 1,25,000 religious women and men in India be among the people who will stand up and say, we will not tolerate this, arrest us? Will we start a jailborough movement so that our constitutional rights, our human rights are protected? As paraphrasing Marx, I would say we have nothing to lose but our chains. As our founders and foundresses, as I said repeatedly, they did what no one else was doing or did not consider worthwhile doing. And this time in our history gives us the opportunity to do what no one else is doing or only a very few are doing or do not consider worthwhile doing. We need to stand up. We need to be counted. We need to speak up. And I think that is the greatest response, the most prophetic response that we need to make at this point of time in the history of this country, where people suffer from pandemic on the one hand and their rights being taken away one by one. Will we stand up? Will our voices be heard? Will we be seen in the forefront? This is the question. This is the challenge that is before each of us. This is the challenge that is before the church. This is the challenge that is before religious women and men in India today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brother Varghese, for this very powerful presentation, going down to history and saying this is not the only pandemic and how people responded, and calling us now, the 125 lakh religious across the country, to open our doors, open our hearts, and be prepared to take a stand. Thank you very much.